We're going to talk about the vagus nerve. So just in the past couple of weeks, I've been seeing articles about this thing popping up everywhere. Maybe, for those of you that watch TV, maybe, I don't know, maybe they're talking about this on a greater level in other areas of popular media, but I'm not really seeing it just up until recently. I first became aware of the vagus nerve a couple of years ago when I went to Eric Rain's Golden Frequency Immersion group experience, in which I myself, I believe, had a really, really intense vagus nerve kind of blockage. And we'll get into that stuff in a minute, but let's talk about what the vagus nerve is, how this thing plays a role. It's an incredibly complex nerve, but what it is the longest and most complex of the 12 primary cranial nerves. Vagus nerve plays a special role in our understanding and interaction with energies of all kinds within the human body. This pair of nerves connects the brain to the internal organs, thus sending information bidirectionally between the brain, the organs, and especially this thing we call the gut-brain axis, which is incredibly important. This is literally the other brain in your body. Most of you guys have some, level of awareness about, the idea that our intestines, our intestinal meridians and interactivity that takes place within those areas of our body actually have an incredible amount of neurons and connectivity with the physical structure of the brain, moving energy up and down our spinal column through our body to act as quite literally another brain in the body. It's a fact. And, as we move a little bit farther along in science, we begin to understand the subtle interplay of electrical, impulses that move through there. So we're going to understand more about that in the future. But one of the things we do know right now, and we started out this very workshop today for those of you guys that were here in the beginning with literal stimulation of your vagus nerve. What happens when we stimulate the vagus nerve? It's had incredible, promise for, treating things like depression, PTSD, Alzheimer's, epilepsy. It can literally change your emotional well-being. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. And so we have, two pairs of these coming out of, this area in the back of our head, which some of us, you guys might recognize this. We talked about this earlier. If you bring your attention to where this little pointer right here, up in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, you see this diagram of the vagus nerve and how it begins to come down out of the back of the head and the back of the neck, right next to this thing over here, cerebellum chakra, one of the primary connection points or the astral cord connection points for your astral body right here. And so what happens is this is being one of the primary entry and exit points along with the sphenoids up here at the temples, is that some form of either, parasitic energy, emotional energy, outside interference, non-organic, whatever it is able to create some form of electrical impulse in the body as a result of entrance through possibly the astral cord and the cerebellum chakra, through, auditory frequencies, through some form of latent, unresolved emotional trauma in the body. And what happens is that vibrates along the pathway of the vagus nerve. And so when the vagus nerve vibrates, it runs through not every single area, but look at where it goes. It hits all of our organs. It's like this conducting, connective electrical cord that runs its way through everything. And so what happens is when we go through this trauma frequency, difficult polarized emotions, when we've got this unresolved kind of, issue rolling around in our body, or even if we're having our physiology is being influenced through some form of implantation or, non-organic energy that's in, our space, it affects the vagus nerve. Not always, but it's one of the areas in which I'm constantly seeing in my day-to-day work, people having these blockages, dark miasmatic energy that runs down the back of their neck. Some people get huge eruptions of energy in the backs of their skulls on the right or left side. In my opinion, not every time, but in many cases that can be due to a buildup or a really highly pressurized discharge of energy that extends through cranial nerves, or specifically the vagus nerve, and it creates a very, very highly charged flow that extends through all these areas of our body. And so when it works its way through things like the lung or the heart on an energetic and emotional level, it's affecting our grief. It's moving into our heart. It's affecting elements of connective emotion and intimacy. It moves into the stomach, and it can affect the ways in which these electrical impulses allow the integration and digestion of foods. It moves into our kidneys. That affects our adrenals, the way we handle this incredible fight or flight instinct. The spleen, which affects our lymphatics, all of these things, stomach, which I just literally confused for the kidney in my pointer. I don't know if you guys noticed that. Very funny. This vagus nerve goes through so many layers of the body. So when this thing is affected, it's literally like this hot wire, like connection point to all of this stuff. And so when this thing is affected through some form of, foreign electrical impulse, you can affect everything. So I might be speaking a little bit redundantly here, but let's look at what this means. When the vagus nerve is affected by implantation, attachment, or other forms of toxic frequency interference, we may experience adrenal fatigue, exhaustion, onset of autoimmune system, shutdown of intuitive signals from the solar plexus, gut and intestinal meridians. That second brain can be effectively deactivated through a frequency of unresolved emotional trauma, or sometimes through really just not listening to our gut instinct. The more and more we fight to turn that off, the more and more we become disconnected and emotionally disconnected from the electrical impulses that move through the body that at certain times need to be activated so that we can be aware of what's going on around us. And so sometimes that happens in the form of involuntary playback of latent traumatic experiences in the body. As a result of vagus nerve stimulation, it can be used to trigger old emotions that will lie dormant in those areas. And so, that can interact with things like the psoas, the liver, the spleen, the kidneys, spleen, where we carry a lot of frustrated energy. You guys, it's a lot of you, for you guys that have done sessions with me, almost always check the spleen. I think it can become very, very backed up, especially with frequency interference. And I say backed up on an emotional level because in my experience, and this might be where, my experience might differ from that of some other people, traditionally when I work with the spleen, this is where I find people's frustration. I find a hot, kind of tense, pressurized, frustrated emotional current that exists as somewhat of a greasy or oily bubble that resides in our belly. It moves oftentimes a little bit over to the left. And so what happens with that is it just sits there and it's like this hot little sack of bitterness inside our body that can interact with the kidneys, which creates that fear, that fight or flight, that adrenaline. That can interact with the liver, which has that rage and that bitterness and that self-punishment. That interacts with that psoas, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, which is literally like a cellular recording device for trauma in your body. And what happens is when that vagus nerve stimulates energetic charge through all these areas, it can be used to artificially induce really intense states in the body, mental and emotional disorders, bipolar mania, anxiety, even suicidal ideation can be kicked in through unresolved emotional trauma signals resulting from extreme vagus nerve stimulation. Oftentimes, you guys, coming in from the back of the head, which is where we have that cerebellum chakra, kind of like in the Matrix. You guys remember they have these, these crazy chords. There's a reason why our consciousness was sort of seeded with those wild sci-fi images, because they're relevant. And so anyway, as we move on, this can also be pressurized or painful sensations around the base of the skull. Some people get these like explosive feelings there, and in my opinion, it's not necessarily a vagus nerve thing all the time, but it's a buildup and then eventual release of highly charged energy that oftentimes take place because there can be these like etheric clamping like devices that'll be placed over these areas of our body, kind of shutting things down, creating a very pressurized environment. So it's very important to be aware of the vagus nerve, especially when you guys are dealing with a lot of anxiety attacks, inappropriate fear in the body, getting stuck in one type of an emotional reaction over and over and over again can come from this really disproportionate amount of energy that moves through the vagus nerve. And so one of the most easiest ways that you guys can literally do right now as I'm talking, some of you guys are going to be brave and you'll start doing this right now, is you start very deep, deliberate breathing down in your belly like you're puffing it up like a balloon. You're blowing a balloon in your belly, and what happens is that's one of the easiest ways to manually stimulate the vagus nerve, which is also why invariably after a course of deep breathing, people tend to relax. It's not just because of the hyperoxygenation. It's because you have this nerve, this vagus nerve running through all these areas of the body, and when it gets down here and it begins to flex and move with your breath, It's relaxing, it's circulating and distributing the disproportionate emotional energetic charge in the body. And for those of you guys that are with me, take a deep breath in and release it. You're going to begin stimulating your vagus nerve in this moment by participating. You're going to gently breathe in again, really big and deep. Just continue to breathe and exhale. And what you're going to find is, as you're listening to the sound of my voice, those of you that are brave enough to experiment with this in this moment, is that you find is that if you continue that deliberate, deep, expansive belly breathing, you will invariably experience some sort of a calming, a change, or a settling of your emotional state. It's a physiological change that results. And just by doing that alone can demonstrate to you the efficacy of looking and treating the vagus nerve, especially when we're talking about implantation, AI implantation, any type of emotional energy that gets stuck in the body. That's a place we want to look at.